Marcus, welcome to the SRMC Tribe Podcast. Obviously, we don't normally call you Marcus. Just to let all the audience know, we are, obviously, the three of us are pretty close friends, and we normally obviously call you Ollie. So probably, I can't see us using the word Marcus again. Didn't even know that was your name, actually. But just to give the audience a bit of a setting of maybe how we sort of describe you. I just thought I'd come up with a few different words.
Whether you'll be happy or not.
Yeah, big
what
idea.
just springs to mind? So SMC lecturer.
Yeah.
Police inspector. See, former.
Yeah.
Kidnap and ransom negotiator.
Yeah.
Deal facilitator.
Yeah.
The human lie detector.
Pete likes that one.
Yeah. Well, that's an interesting concept, but if you like it, you can keep that one.
Well, negotiator.
Negotiator. Wade off Roadhouse.
What's his name? Sam Garrett.
The Silver Fox.
Sam Garrett.
Yeah.
Obviously, negotiation is a bit of a mystique around it. You know, a bit of a Hollywood thing. There's quite a few Hollywood films around with negotiation in. Dog Day Afternoon, John Q, The Negotiator, really good film. Samuel L. Jackson film, I think. You know, which is a pretty cool thing. And I know there's probably not many, not that we're trying to advertise the job here, there's probably not many roles that people are going to do as negotiators. It's probably more of a police thing than anything else. But I'm sure we're all negotiating through life, and it's not just negotiation. It's detecting deception, detecting lies, reading people.
Communicating better. That's a bit. I think the biggest takeaway when I've ever listened to you is that part of it is that actually a lot of what you're going to talk about is just to make you better at communicating, which will help you in everything.
Essentially.
Like now you spin it in the corporate world, which is where there's money to be made, thankfully for you.
Yeah, I think first and foremost, there is a mystique, I think, but there doesn't necessarily have to be. It's. I think a huge dose of humility. And I think, like you said there, not everybody can be a law enforcement hostage negotiator. Predominantly it's a police role. There's some armed forces, specialist units that, recruit for negotiation. But yeah, I mean, you've got to be in the police, and then you've got to essentially be, I guess, noticed, or at least apply for that space, that vacancy when it comes up within the team. And yeah, whilst there is some Hollywood glam around it, just normal people, really. But there are certain things that we do and apply, not just when you're in an incident, but outside the incident, that I guess keeps it real. There's no place for any egos there. And that was something, as part of my story in some respects, which I'm sure we'll come on to, that, we all have got an ego, but I guess it's that confidence, but not overconfident, that it starts to bleed into arrogance. And I think maybe in my younger years, for sure, that I guess some people would have seen me as arrogant.
Maybe we can go back there then, mate, before we get into, because there's quite a lot of bits we can get into in the negotiation side, but what brought you to that? I know we obviously know your background, but if you give us the audience a bit of an overview of where you went from, I know, in the military.
Do you want the short story or the long story?
Well, obviously not from the day you were born, but actually your real journey on shaping who you are now.
Yeah, even joining the police, you don't come across as your typical police inspector in the nicest possible way.
That's very nice. So what is a typical police inspector?
Well,
well, as you know, I was in the army for 8 years. I was an engineer, and then I never really had an aspiration to join the police. It wasn't like I was at school and thought, this is what I'm going to do as a career.
Sorry, jump in, mate, but you were one of the very few that did Commando MP company, weren't you?
I knew you were going to say that.
Not a lot that do both.
Well, I guess there is a few. Yeah, I did do both, and again, that wasn't intentional. So I ended up I was at 5'9" first, young soldier, very naive, bit wet behind the ears. 18 years old. Look at some of the pictures back then and thinking, bloody hell, I look like a boy. And then I ended up at 9 Para Squadron. Cracking 4 years there. And it was about the time that guys were either getting out to go to the fire brigade or the police, or they're going to selection. It was a funny time. Or, going and working overseas, the maritime industry and what have you. And I met this guy who I used to go to school with, and who played for a football team, actually. And I went back home one day and played football, and he was chatting away, and he said, I've joined the police. And, the conversation went from there. He was in his training. He was telling me about the things he was doing. I thought, this seems a pretty exciting job. And I just looked into it further. And despite a career that I think I was fairly successful in my own right, it took me 3 times to get into the police. I kept going. I really wanted to get in. Yeah, 3 times over the space of about 3 years, 2 years.
Just getting through the written process application. That's quite hard, isn't it?
I had a very squaddy mindset. Lacked a lot of self-awareness. And just I learned. I had to start to learn from my errors, and eventually got in.
What year was this?
Proud as punch. I was 19. So it was between 96 and 98 I was applying. And I joined in 98, Nottinghamshire Police. And then, my career in the police service, couple of years on the front line in quite a challenging area that I worked in Nottinghamshire.
Were you living in Nottinghamshire? Why did you choose Nottinghamshire? Was that one that accepted you at the time, or a bit more to it?
Somebody have me, please.
Yeah.
I applied for West Yorkshire, South Yorkshire, then Cumbria.
I think people work out from the accent you're not from Nottinghamshire. That was all.
Yeah. No, and then there was a friend of mine, a guy called Ian Tooley, who he was in 9 squads and he'd got out 18 months before. And I connected with him, and he'd mentioned Nottinghamshire Police, and I thought, you're recruiting, and literally 3 months from sending off the papers, I was wearing a uniform. Don't happen like that now, but they aren't pretty quick. And I think one thing I can look back on, might not jump about a bit, but I always was very... People do say, you don't come across as a typical cop, or you don't come across as like, and I think there's almost like an archetype, a perception that people assume what a cop is like. There's a lot of police officers that don't fit that typical cop mould. You gotta have your personality, your character's got to come out in applying your craft. But yeah, a couple of years on the front line, driving the squad cars, responding to various incidents, and if you ring 3-9s, for example, and it needs an immediate response, then it's your local divisional cops that would go there first, and if it needs specialist officers, then they'd be deployed. And yeah, I did close to 3 years there. Quite a challenging estate, as I say. It was good because it gave me some real good foundations. Applying my craft as a cop, learning to be a cop. What does that actually mean? What does it look and feel like? And then I went on to like the squads. So you've got like semi-covert squads. So they do like warrants, surveillance, football games, projects, that sort of stuff. And it's quite a tight-knit teams that you work on in those squads. And, you become very close to, your colleagues. Very similar. That's what I liked about that, because it's very similar. It was a similar camaraderie, should I say, that it is in the armed forces. You small unit.
Yeah.
Your success is built on trusting each other and performing to a high level. And then in Nottinghamshire at the time, this was about early 2000s, people who are old enough will probably remember the hard times that Nottinghamshire was going through at the time. There's quite a lot of gun crime and such like.
It was the capital, wasn't it, at one time?
It got branded, sadly it got branded the gun capital of whether that was true or not. But you can imagine from a political sense, that must have sent shockwaves through those in higher positions throughout Nottinghamshire, local authorities, police and so on. then they've got to manage partner expectations and the rest of it. But yeah, so as a result of that, the people on the squads ended up backfilling the CID teams, the Criminal Investigation Department, because the detectives on divisional CID were then going up and making up numbers on the homicide unit. So there was a gap, there was a void. And I went and I took my turn, said I'll go and have 3 months. I had 3 months on the divisional CID. So, okay, this is all right. Says, can I have another 3 months? Yeah. And my boss said at the time, he said, yeah, you can have another 3 months. But if after that 6-month period, you need to make a decision whether you're coming back because we need to send somebody else from the team or you're staying. And, I had another 3 months. I had a great tutor there, a guy called Gary Widdowson, bit of a legend in his own right. And, old school detective. And, and that was it. And I started my CID career probably in, 2010, something like that. And then from there, I got promoted to DS. Again, took me a couple of times to get promoted to sergeant, but kept chomping at the bit. Again, it was like learning from my errors. Not quite, pennies not dropping.
You still enjoying your time though?
Loving it. Yeah, I was loving it. I love policing. Policing's a great job. Policing is a great job because
it gets a lot of slack at the moment.
You get flack. I think it's par for the course. You get a lot of flack from, you got the power to take people's liberty away, and if you do something slightly wrong, that can be amplified quite significantly.
A difficult job to do at the moment.
It is.
Being a police officer is like probably one of the hardest times.
Yeah. I mean, you very rarely get thanked, but you often get criticised. Yeah. But yeah, it's a difficult role. But I was enjoying policing, got promoted to sergeant, and then I started to realise, I mean, in my earlier careers in the forces, I got to like lance jacking. I got to junior sergeant in the junior army as a 16-year-old, and got an accolade of winning best section over the years, kind of top troop competition. So there was something about, I thought there's something about my leadership, there's something how I work and bring a team together. And then that started to emerge then when I got promoted to sergeant, so coming all the way back, is that I was almost seen as like a troubleshooter, so that put me into positions and to pull teams together. So areas where perhaps they were failing or, we need to up performance, and just trying to change things around. And, we had quite a lot of success, the teams. I worked on some brilliant teams as a sergeant. 3 years on the child protection unit. Well, they called it the child abuse unit. I don't know if they still call it that. That doesn't quite sit right with me, that terminology. You imagine you're answering the phone, it's a DS Oldroyd child abuse unit. Yeah, I'm ringing up about my child that's being abused. So I like to call it the child protection unit. And the 3 years on there, the cops working on there, there's one or two that spring to mind and you think, wow, I take my hat off to you. This is
tough job.
You've been on this unit for a long time, and you crack on. You treat every job. You give every job your all. You take your victims as you find them. Conscientious, driven, motivated, and you continue. I had 3 years on there. I won't say I'd had enough after 3 years, but I had an opportunity to move, and so I did. But and then I went back to mainstream CID. Worked my way to getting promoted to inspector. DI, very different to being a DS. It's a big jump. You're almost, if we're going to use a mining terminology, you're still on the coalface as a DS. You can get on the coalface, you can get in there with your troops, and you can take a step back if you like. So you can pick and choose. It's one of the best jobs. You speak to any cop, and they'll tell you DS is the best rank. It's great. But as an inspector, few and far between, you're on the coalface with a pickaxe in your hand. You might go down to the coalface, and say hello and, show your face and see what's going on, but you're not there.
What would be the sort of equivalent for thinking in the military, just for those that don't understand the policing rank structure? How would you describe that?
Well, from
officer.
Yeah, I mean, you know, your sergeants and your staff sergeants. I think there's that transition. Your sergeant, and then to staff sergeant, and you know, second lieutenant. Yeah,
like
that's similar.
Captain, major, as an inspector, perhaps.
Probably second lieutenant to captain. Maybe captain's a little bit more like chief inspector. Yeah, and so it was very different. I had to learn very quickly. So, in terms of my thinking and leading strategically, I like getting my hands on the tools. I like getting into the weeds, and that necessarily wasn't what my management wanted to. You know, I started to learn this term around, you know, you're managing up, which was another concept. It's like, well, what do you mean managing up? You know, essentially knowing what your boss wants of you, what the pressure's there under, you know, knowing that you're a safe pair of hands that you're going to deliver.
A bit more political as well, perhaps.
Yeah, a lot more political, you know, recognising that they've got a boss above them, they've got their peers and partners from partnership agencies as well. And so, you know, recognising that. And I must admit, I didn't do that very well when I look back. Towards the end of my career as an inspector, I started to recognise that was an important attribute to be able to recognise that. But yeah, I still got stuck in as an inspector when I first got promoted. But yeah, and then with 10 years to go, well, this is where my life changed a bit. So coming back a little bit before I got promoted to inspector, because I feel I wouldn't have got promoted to inspector unless I had this life changing. I thought success in the police that you had to get promoted and get up there. That's what I thought quite early on. And I got into this promotion scheme, like an accelerated talent management process called it's called HPDS at the time. High potential accelerated promotion. And I got to an interview with like second in command in the police and head of HR. Didn't get the role. Pretty gutted. I thought I'd put a lot of effort into preparing. I put all my eggs into one basket. I thought, this is where my police career's going. And then I got that email. And a lot of people around me as well were saying, oh, yeah, you know, if anyone's going to get it, you're going to get it. You know, they were telling me what I wanted to hear, which wasn't necessarily the right thing. And, I got that email. You know, when you read the first line of a letter or an email where you haven't been successful, you read it about 3 times, right?
Yeah, what?
I remember doing that when I didn't get in West Yorkshire Police. Successful, unsuccessful. Anyway, yeah, so I wasn't successful, but I got invited back for an interview, a feedback interview. And I hold this process or that time in my life dearly because it did change not only my course of my career, but it changed me as an individual. And I went for the feedback interview. And imagine police headquarters, one at Nottinghamshire, is, you know, it's got that old oak panelling along the command corridor, big red leather chairs, similar chairs to what you're sitting in there, but, you know, big red leather. And I went, gets into this office, and there's a lady sat there, head of HR, and I remember 2 things. The first was, she said, we didn't think you were very self-aware. Your levels of self-awareness, they're not at the levels we expect for somebody on this programme. And she mentioned something about emotional intelligence, and I thought, what? What do you mean?
What's that?
Yeah, I mean, God, it was like, it was like she was slicing me in 2. I felt like I was getting wounded. Not because I knew what it meant, because I didn't. At that time, I won't say I was clueless. I could have probably had a guess and not been far off, but it wasn't something I considered important. The other thing I remember is I did majority of the talking. Now, when I look back on that, she was absolutely right. But I think that crossroads in my life was where I came to embrace failure. I'd always been good at stuff, but it was more like hands-on, practical, physical stuff. I always excelled. So I didn't, apart from, more like the academic side, application forms, trying to join the police and stuff, but actually doing the job and getting hands-on. I'm a doer. I do it well. And it was at that point I thought, right, I need to have a look at this. What does she mean? So I sat in my car. I went back, came out wounded.
It's like an ego check. That.
Yeah, my ego was like bent in two. And I sat in the car. I always remember, and it was a time that, smartphones were getting smart and all the rest of it, and you've got Google and you'd have to go back too far before we were all using bricks, those 8210s or what have you. But I had a smartphone and, I put into Google, emotional intelligence. I don't talk about this on the course. Yeah. It was life-changing. And it was about breaking the ice on a huge lake and going underneath.
Like light bulb moment time.
Oh, man, it was it was a lighthouse beacon. Yeah, can't stress enough. And, from there, I just wanted to learn. I realised why perhaps not just that, but other opportunities may have gone by the wayside, maybe why some relationships were not developing or had developed the way they should have done. I was questioning all my relationships with individuals across the piece.
Sorry, mate, can you just explain, just for the listeners, because there'll be other people going, what's emotional intelligence? Just in a nutshell, how would you describe that? It's a difficult one, isn't it?
Well, I wouldn't say it's difficult. It depends how much you want to apply to it. So my interpretation of emotional intelligence is one, recognising, knowing who you are, knowing the legacy that you leave behind, considering the legacy that you're going to be imparting on people when you're with them. When you go into an environment, you change the environment, and it's knowing that, knowing how you feel, knowing perhaps what mood you might have arrived in. I mean, I've arrived here today, pretty
stressful drive.
Yeah, I was a bit in a bit of a stress. I was wondering, is this going to go ahead? Stuck in traffic on the M1 there. But manage it. So it's recognising your emotional state and the impact that you're going to have, but being able to regulate that. You can't control an emotion, but you can regulate it. You can do things to regulate your emotion. So that's kind of the first part. And then the second is then once you've got that mastered, and it does take time to practice that skill, and you've got to constantly reflect and exercise this, is then you can read other people. You can then start to read other people and perhaps identify how they might be feeling. And by doing so, then you can start to empathise, you can start to acknowledge, you can start to ask questions in an appropriate way that's not going to offend. And then once you've done that, the last part is long-term relationships and building those networks. It was one of the first books I actually bought when we talk about emotional intelligence. So the first book I bought was 2 books I bought. One was Emotional Intelligence by Daniel Goleman, who popularised the term emotional intelligence. There were other academics who've been looking at this in the 80s, early 90s, and it's gone back along. That social intelligence is been looked at for a long time, from the Greek philosophers. But Daniel Goleman actually popularised it and brought out the book Emotional Intelligence, and I've still got it today. And I remember being on a train, and I read it in quick time, and I've got my highlight, and I've made all the notes in there. And I'm like, oh my God, this is gold dust. Lots of good stuff in there. It's all about relationship building, knowing self, knowing others. And then the other book I bought, which was recommended to me by I went to find a mentor. Can't stress how getting a mentor is, how beneficial that is. And my mentor said, well, try this one. And it was the one by Dale Carnegie back in, I think, published in 1936, the principles of which are just as relevant today, how to win friends and influence people. And I was like, wow. Yeah. And that was my journey, and it was from that I got recognised in terms of how I applied myself, interacted with others. And it was another negotiator on the team that I was on a leadership course with, and she said to me after we'd been doing some practical exercise in the leadership course, and she's like, "You consider being a negotiator?"
Do your behaviour change massively, do you think, from that point?
For me, yeah. Yeah.
People would have noticed that, like externally would have noticed that in you, do you think? Or
I think
you just felt it more in you?
I think there's a misnomer that, you look at Hollywood, one-liners, fast cars, leading roles, guns, sheriff's badges, all that. It's, that's sensationalised, but this misnomer that negotiators are, chatty, got the gift of the gab. They haven't. They've got dexterity. They've got that mental dexterity to be able, and agility to move around a given context. They've got an ability to manage their ego. They've got an ability to listen. They've got an ability to demonstrate presence and connect. And you've got to do that pretty quick. But they've also got that ability to know how fast you can, not push that, but how to apply that. Because you need, for example, I don't know, let's say you got somebody on a bridge over the M1, the motorway shut down. I mean, that's costing the local economy billions, billions, right? Particularly if it's around major cities. But then you're getting in your earpiece or from your negotiator coordinator, the bosses are wanting you to get this wrapped up pretty quick, and they might start saying, we're losing millions. It's like, I'm not going to be rushed. And so being able to deal with external pressures, the most important thing is that person's life, not the economy. That's for managers to manage. That's for commanders to command. As a negotiator, it can be quite a lonely place. But you're the one. I mean, listen, at the end of the day, if things go wrong, you're the one that's going to be in the coroner's court. You're the one that's going to be answering to the coroner why it appears to me that you were rushing this. It appeared to me that you were not applying the tactics and the tools and techniques that you're trained to do. Well, I'm not prepared to do that. Because we do wear body cams, so you can put them in a tactical mode so they're not flashing or the screen's on. So they're recording. And quite often you might tell the subject who you're with that they might say, why are you filming me? You can talk your way around it, why you've got that. Protect you, protect me. But that's another part of being a negotiator is you've got to be able to maneuver around the circumstance. Things change in a situation. They don't stay the same from when you first get there to an hour later or 2 hours later. Vehicles arrive, people change. You might get people in office blocks. You might get phone calls coming in. There's a whole raft of things that happen, and you've got to be able to respond in a way that you're not rabbit in headlights.
You think about, you would say a good police officer, a core skill more than anything else. Where you'd say, that's a good police officer. Somebody with a high emotional intelligence. You're continually negotiating, kind of stopping a situation, being able to read it before it happens. More than any job, really. In some ways, there's probably other examples out there, but if you really had to sum up what would make a good police officer is high emotional. No, obviously not every. There's good and bad in every job, but that's got to be like the core skill of a police officer, really.
I think so. I was reading a study recently, as you know, I'm doing some academic work, and surprisingly, this study showed that a negotiator, there's not a great deal of difference between a negotiator and a police officer in terms of emotional intelligence, that was just one study. Having applied that trade, from a practical, personal perspective, I'd probably disagree with that, and there's other studies out there as well that probably, probably say otherwise. But yeah, cops do have a high degree of emotional intelligence. I think it's, through the recruitment processes now, they do some psychometric testing, which is all based on the back of emotional intelligence work. But I think, that is definitely one thing. But being, I guess, intuitive, which, bleeds back into your senses and that what are you reading, being having good levels of perception. I think being fair. Yeah, I think being fair.
You listen to some good stuff there. So what would you say has made you a good negotiator then? Obviously some of those points, but if you actually look at yourself...
Well, I'm glad you said a good negotiator.
Yeah. No, you are,
where's the proof there?
No, yeah, we've only met a few, mate, and you're our favourite one.
Well, my own journey and that desire to continue to learn. So it's like, I was thinking about this driving up, and what makes a good footballer? What makes a good tennis player? What makes a good craftsman, tradesman? You look at your application. What did I do well? What didn't I do so well? How can I improve? Seeking feedback, asking others, reflecting on your own performance. And so I think that's what makes a good negotiator, is that, that relentless pursuit of wanting to maintain and improve your craft. There's a million books out there by negotiators, self-help books. There's a thread that runs through all of them, and it's about relationships.
I've got a take on this, mate, from obviously watching you, how many ever courses you've done for us and hundreds of people you put through our program. Obviously, I've never seen you negotiate in your police career, but there's obviously a natural ability, whether you're born with how you learned, around the sort of, then obviously you continually, you spent a career trying to improve yourself and learn this stuff back to front and different theories on it. But there must be so much you do that you couldn't even articulate or even pass on. You just do, as you couldn't even teach. It's just a natural thing you do. Is in this sort of, in the mist, that you couldn't pass on. You don't even know why you're doing it, or that you are doing it when you negotiate with someone. All the little ticks or sort of micro expressions or whatever, or your changes in voice. There's all stuff about that you teach. But there must be some bits you just don't even know you're doing.
I think your personality has got to come through. You're not a robot. You've got to come across as a human being.
Being a good communicator. I think that if I said of all the people we know, I'd probably say yourself, Barry, like not head
Barry
and
will be
shoulder
happy
above.
you've said that.
But no, there's some people there that I think
are
very good communicators, and I think that would, you're one of those I would say.
But you look at what does make a good communicator, and it's I look at it this way. Yeah, I've said some things to be a good negotiator, but being a good communicator is about, as humans, we all have an ego. We all want a sense of purpose and importance. That's innate in all of us. And being a negotiator is about seeing that in the other individual, and what's beneath the surface. What's driving that behaviour? What's driving that sense of importance? What's driving that ego? What are the wants, needs, desires? And quickly identifying those and framing the conversation around that, being able to build rapport, finding some commonality, even if it's somebody's totally different to you, they're the worst villain in the world and they want to commit an atrocity. You'll still have something in common. But it's finding what's driving that behaviour and being able to articulate yourself in a way that you're demonstrating presence. You're not ambushing the conversation. You slow down. Because a lot of people, when they come under stress and it's a fight, flight, freeze, we generally speed up. Your body speed up because they're getting ready. And it's remaining calm under the immense amounts of pressure that's around you. the physiological responses that you can present with, from fidgeting to getting red in the face to your breathing increase into your pupils getting big, all these sort of signs that would say somebody's under stress. It's managing that, because you got to come across as calm. Because if you're not calm, well, who else is going to sort the day out? It's being able to do that. And I've seen good examples where people, even in negotiators, some negotiators, it's like any trade, some are better than others. In any trade, you're still going to have you're still trained to apply the job, but you do see ones that shine more than others.
I just think when you said about even sort of bad people can be. My daughter had a Second World War homework for history. Should have read something about Hitler, but he's obviously an amazing orator or communicator and negotiator to convince. He obviously had highly emotionally intelligent to convince the people to do X, Y, Z. It's not just as an example of a bad person.
I don't know. I mean, I've not studied Hitler.
I know you'll be careful what you say.
But whether he had high emotions of intelligence or not, some might say, well, he ruled with an iron fist. But let's put it this way: he was smart. Whether we agree with what his objectives were, he was obviously smart.
But he was a great speaker, wasn't he? Just like sort of Winston Churchill's sort of style. Whether he did rule with the iron fist, that was something I kind of changed my daughter's homework slightly. Going, well, he actually was. He got his people to come along with. Yeah, he
was able to inspire them. When you look at a lot of the work that's going on now in academia around, the importance of emotional intelligence, owners, CEOs of companies put way more weight on recruiting somebody who's highly emotionally intelligent rather than having a high IQ. You can have all the skills in the world. You could have all the accreditations in the world, but if you can't manage people and relationships, unless you're working in silo by yourself, solo,
that's a big headache for most business, isn't it? It's just
we work with
problems.
people. So we can teach the skills around process and procedure and policy. Come along. I'd much rather employ somebody who's highly emotionally intelligent that's coming along with a bag full of accreditations every day of the week.
Oh yeah, 100%.
100%. Yeah. And
cult leaders, they must be highly emotionally intelligent.
Getting all the controversial stuff.
Well, I guess when you look at, we've not mentioned Cialdini yet. Robert Cialdini, he conducted. Anybody who knows about Robert Cialdini, he did the 4 decades study, and he actually got employed in various roles in society because he wanted to know, how does a car salesperson influence a potential buyer to buy a car, for example, selling houses, all the rest of it. And he's got a lot of work out there, and it's fascinating stuff. We can influence, but then if you're using the laws of influence to manipulate, then perhaps that might fit into somebody who's a cult leader. But what you are essentially doing with influence is you are playing to a person's ego and also playing to bias and playing into their shortcut thinking. Those heuristics that we create in life, those quick decisions that we don't even think about. So playing to those, playing to the ego, I think that's where negotiators work well.
You just said like manipulation, like kind of like a negative. Well, obviously the word's like a negative in it, but all those sort of, maybe a good communicator or highly emotionally intelligent will be using forms of manipulation at times. Like
manipulating a conversation is different from manipulating a person.
Yeah, so, listen, sometimes there's certain negotiations you wouldn't ever lie. Yeah. More so around crisis intervention, and there's other negotiations that you would lie.
Or as a sort of a CEO of a company, then, or kind of, maybe it's not the right word to use, but you are at times having to manipulate different personalities to achieve the company aim or the goal. Or playing people then? That's other,
Yeah, I think if we look at that word manipulation, if the end goal is for the greater good of the company or to, please customers, partners, the end goal, whatever that is, if you can go to bed at night and say, well, I'm happy you did that, but if somebody feels the pain emotionally or physically, or, you're pulling the one in a sense that, you're exposing somebody's vulnerabilities, that wouldn't sit with me. But yeah, I mean, listen, however you perceive that word manipulation, I guess you can apply it. It's contextual, right?
Yeah.
It's contextual. But, to influence, if we look at influence manipulation,
influence
if we're looking at it for good reasons, you could say magician's manipulative.
I probably should have said it better then, shouldn't it? What's the difference between influence and manipulation? And that probably would have been a better question than how I framed it.
I think we thrashed that one out, haven't we?
Yeah. No, I just kind of, we're all kind of doing it in different ways, whether it's conscious or subconsciously.
Yeah. Yeah. But going back to that question you asked, it is about, you asked it, Dunk, it's that continuous desire to look at your trade craft and just keep moving forward and trying to be better the next time.
Brilliant, mate. It's a really insightful views into a life as a negotiator. Would you be able to share, obviously without naming names and things like that, is there any particular case that had an impact? I know you had numerous cases over the years, but if you're happy to share one, that'd be great for the listeners to hear. We've obviously heard a few.
Yeah, I mean, they all stick in your mind. Every single one for its own reasons. Whether it was the dynamics, the circumstance that was driving what was going on, the personalities you're with, where you had to travel from and to, time of day. So yeah, there's one or two. There was one in particular that following finishing the coming to a conclusion, it was maybe a 5 hour job. Literally half an hour later, I'm in my bath at home drinking a glass of red wine. And I'm laying there thinking, I've just been doing that. But you've got to be able to decompress, right? You've got to be able to find your space. It was a guy, it was a suicidal guy. As a negotiator, you're going to be dealing with people who are, barricaded themselves into a house or a space because they don't want to be arrested, or they're holding somebody hostage because there'll be something that they're unhappy about. It might be a hostage that they've purposely taken, or, just bad timing that someone's in there at the time, so they thought, I'm gonna keep them as a hostage. And and then you got rooftop protests, suicide intervention, kidnap ransom. So you're dealing with all these incidents, but you do find yourself getting involved with a lot of, sadly, individuals who have got a diminished desire to live. I don't like saying a desire to die, because I don't think anybody really wants to die. It's only you look at the research, there's only a small percentage that would say that. And these are from suicide attempt survivors. Because 90% say, well, as soon as I jumped, or as soon as I pulled the trigger, I knew it was the wrong thing. And so, yeah, having a diminished desire to live is how I look at it. And that always, I think that's a good frame of mind to arrive at the door of a negotiation. Leave your ego at the door. That person doesn't really want to die. It's just that moment in time. They don't know which way else to turn. And as this guy, it was on like a multi-story car park, and he'd been there for probably the best part of an hour. And what happens with those sort of jobs, the response cops would go to it first, naturally, try to talk the individual down. And if it's not succeeding, then the commander on the ground, which would probably be a sergeant or the inspector, would say, well, okay, we've got an on-call negotiation team. Well, we're not making any progress, any positive steps. So let's get a negotiator. And this one I went to, and it was a bitterly cold morning. It was rush hour traffic in Nottinghamshire. And I was up at Mansfield at the time. And the negotiator coordinator, so they're the person that will get a call from the control room to say, can you contact your negotiators? So there'll be 2 of us on duty or on call. We need them at this location. So I got the call from the coordinator, and he said, right, what are you doing? I just finished morning briefing, literally, early doors. I was tucking into my porridge. I'd warmed up in the microwave there, and I got the call saying, we've got one down in the city. Right, okay. So you have a grab bag. I was keeping the car, when you're on duty. And I said, well, what's in the grab bag? Well, things like a ballistic vest, glasses, ear defenders.
Gun.
It's not guns. Not all, none of this sort of stuff. But you'd also have some real practical, nice items like, you'd have some hot chocolates in there. You'd have some sweets in there. You might have some batteries, a torch. Some things that might make your life a bit. Sometimes, I'd often have a toothbrush and toothpaste in there as well, because if the job's wrong, it's nothing worse than having a set of furry teeth, is there? So, I got my grab bag, and I there was a car that had been arranged to take me down, blue lights. And I remember thinking to the guy that was driving the car down, I thought, why are you going this way? He went the long way around for some reason. Anyway. One thing that we'll normally do is cut the sirens as they're getting closer, because the last thing you want to do is startle somebody. And he didn't, so I told him to cut the sirens and the flashing lights and what have you. And I met the sergeant on the cordon there, and he gave me a handover, a brief handover. We agreed how I was going to then approach this guy. And then, you're now starting to look at, well, how do we actually apply? So we spoke earlier, didn't we, about being a good communicator, and what does that exactly look like? Well, it bleeds into everything from how you present to the way you speak, how you hold yourself, and the words that you string together. Now, some might say, I couldn't string a sentence together because I'm from Leeds. But I think you've got to be real, you've got to be authentic. And I know, joking aside. And so I'm speaking to this sergeant, and we're like, okay, so this is what we're going to do. And when I approached this, so we've got by the corner, and I can see this guy's about 30 yards away, and he's hanging onto the railing. So you imagine a set of railings, and then on the other side, you've got a 100-foot drop. And he stood on like a 10-inch little ledge. And it was cold. And one of my biggest concerns for a job like that is they might slip. And, that's one of the things that I would always say is, once I've established my position there with them and I've got a little bit of rapport, would you mind? I know you're on there and you've got your reasons for coming here today, but it is a small ledge and I really don't want you to fall. Would you, if I move back a bit, would you be prepared to perhaps stand a bit differently or turn and face the railings? Because he was stood with his hands behind him and he was leaning forward out into the abyss in the 100-foot drop. It's like, and you're thinking, oh my God, if I get this wrong, or if I say something, or if I make a sudden movement, or if there's something I say that he doesn't like, or the way I say something, it could just go. And so you're constantly thinking of all these things. And so I approached this guy in a way that I had my arms out. We'd also asked, we radioed through to the cop who was currently speaking to him that wasn't making any progress. Just to explain, I think this guy's name was Dave, and I don't think that's not going to breach any kind of, data or anything. It could be Dave from where.
You're on like ground level.
Yes, we're on
that level.
Yes, we're on ground level. And it was like I think the car was like an old built into an old quarry. And so we'd explain to the cop to introduce to this guy Dave that I, there's a negotiator come in or somebody. I don't think we like to use that term negotiator because it can obviously create a false impression. Yeah. And there's then an expectation. And so, you know, there's somebody, I think it said specialist, or there's somebody that's on duty that you know, is qualified to do this. And anyway, I get introduced, and I'm probably as far away to the railings as I am to you guys. So what's that? 6 feet, 7 feet maybe. And you've always got to think about your introduction. And this is like anything in life when you're meeting somebody new. And although the introduction might be slightly different, you're meeting somebody who's potentially going to jump to somebody that maybe you're going to strike up a business partnership with. But you've got to think about it. How are you going to introduce yourself? And I remember when I was driving down there, and any good negotiator worth the salt will practice that introduction. And I used to do it. I used to flick my body worn on just to show my professional application. So I'll be in the car with my body worn on, saying, right, I'm now practicing. You're not going to say it verbatim, but it just starts to get you into the flow, gets you into the space. You know, hi, I'm Marcus. I'm with the police. With a good pause. You know, the fact that you're here today and, you know, you stood on that ledge on such a cold morning in February would say to me that, you know, something terrible's going on for you right now. Or words to that effect. And then just leave it. And I practiced that. And it might have come out slightly differently, but... And I could see a slight shuffle in his manner. And he almost pulled himself back a little bit, and he looked over his shoulder. Because he knew I was there because of the introduction. And he said, yeah. He said, you'll have no idea. You got no idea what's happened. Now that for me is gold dust, because that's a big hook. The hook being what's happened. So I could have gone down that line, perhaps echoed that with a little bit of inflection to show interest, or acknowledge that, no, I don't know what's happened. Whatever it is, it must be terribly difficult for you. Do you want to tell me about that? Or
that was my first reaction when you said that. That's
or, you know, everybody's got a story, or what's the journey you've taken? You know, there's many ways in which you can bleed into that. But you have to come across that you are sincere, that you do genuinely care. And you do. I mean, I did care about my craft. I did genuinely care. And I think that has to come out. You have to show that you care. But I think I went down the lines of, I did use that later, but at that point it was something like, well, I'm guessing then that you're sensing that nobody knows what it feels like, nobody cares about whatever it is that's going on. You that's how you're feeling right now, that nobody gets you. Is that right? Something like that. And so now I'm playing to the empathy. I need to, if somebody's highly distressed, whether, you know, somebody wants to take their own life or whether it's a business partnership, you've got to be prepared to listen and empathise with where that other person's coming from. I spoke earlier about ego and purpose and what drives that. Well, I was starting to fathom out what was going on. And we you know, the conversation progressed. He did turn around and face the railings. You know, I used the line about, you know, I wouldn't want you to slip, and I waited for the right time to be able to ask him that. I think it's like a game of cards. I think when you negotiate, you start off generally with a pretty crap hand, and it's through the art of conversation and elicitation that you then start to pick up some better cards. And that's the information they're giving you. Put them into your hand and get rid of your crap cards. So you've now almost got, building up to a run or a royal floor show, 2 pairs and a set of threes, you know, 3 threes. And that's how I liken it. And so you haven't got the cards to play when you first start a negotiation. So you've got to embed yourself into that conversation, show you care, be intimate in that, be present, and then start to build a rapport. And there's a thing we use in negotiation called the behavioural change stairway model, which has been adapted over the years, but that came about from, well, when negotiation became an actual discipline in law enforcement in the 1970s. I'll not bore you with that story, but it's out there. Yeah. But, we've got this process called the behavioural change stairway, which is essentially, it's a relationship model to building a relationship. So you actively listen, we empathise and acknowledge, build rapport, your self-disclosure, finding similar ground, common ground, looking at what builds trust from your credibility, reliability, following through with what you say you're going to do, showing that you care and that your interest is solely about them and the general public and those elements to build trust. And so once you've established that, you've got this effective hand that you can then start to throw them down. And that's the influence. And this guy, I had a colleague join me, maybe after about an hour. And a few things happened in that negotiation. One, he told me, I found out what he did. He worked for the local authority. And I could see and I could sense that he was a loyal worker and had been. He said, I'd never taken a day off sick. Okay, great. That is definitely an ace card. I know what his work ethic is. So I can play to his ego. He told me that he worked for the council and that he fixed street furniture. The days when people were just smashing up bush shelters. Oh, okay. Maybe, I don't know how long ago, 10, 15 years ago. There was this craze, wasn't there? and setting fire to bins and all that. And he said, yeah, I'm one of the guys that goes around and fixes all these. And so so his sense of purpose was, he was getting paid a wage, but he'd worked in that job for 40 years, never had a day off sick, and he was fixing stuff to provide a service for the public. Brilliant. It was in a same-sex relationship, and he had significant health issues. So there's some bad stuff going on. But there was some ace cards that I was able to pick up. And so I had them, and I didn't play them. I just kept them in my hand. But I also matched to some degree and built similarity and rapport just through some simple movements. So at one point he said, can you swear on this podcast?
Yeah.
He said, I'm fucking freezing. And I had to make a decision whether we were going to give him a jacket to put on. Because obviously he's cold, he's on a little ledge, and by the very nature of him putting a jacket on, it could fall, right? It's going to die. But then I could also use that to my advantage, that the coat's on this side. We might use that as a tactical option to say, look, I'll move back, there's a coat here. Come on this side of the railings, put the coat on, get your cup of tea. You can do all that, of course you can. But you've got to manage that dinosaur emotional part of the brain first. You've got to engage that first and settle that.
Like a game of chess, you're thinking like steps ahead. You're like, he's going to do this. If I say this, he probably react like this, which means I can then do that. It is like, however you look at it, game of cards, game of chess, you're always looking 2-3 moves ahead. How there's different avenues this could take. Anyway, I said, look, can't do the coat thing. He said, can I move along the side of the railings? I think I've told this story on SRMC. I've not heard this one, no.
You've not heard?
No.
So he says, can I move along the side of the railings? Now, on the top of this little ledge was some pipes that must have had some wiring in that were bolted on. So it wasn't totally flat, and it was only, 8-10 inch. It wasn't big. He said, can I move along? And he started to do it, and I'm like, I said, listen, Dave, I said, please don't move too far along. He said, but if you really feel it, I can't stop you, your legs, but really hold on tight. And I said, would you mind if I walked along with you? So he's like, imagine this. So there's now a crowd, right? It's like 9, 10, whatever in the morning. Traffic's at a standstill. There's people watching out the skies, high rises around. And you've got this cop, me, and this guy on the ledge, and we're both like crabs. So he's like moving one hand to the next and shimmying his leg to the next and then moving along and then kicking his leg back, kicking his other leg back to stretch and keep warm. We've all done that when we're cold, right? And I said to him, and I wanted to do the same because I was getting cold too. And I was using that. I said, look, I'm obviously not as cold as you, Dave, but I've been here with you now for 2 or 3 hours and I'm getting cold too. So we're in this together. So I'm really putting myself into his shoes. I says, can I come? Do you mind if I move along? So we're now shimmying along together, and then we shimmied back. And then this guy, Dave, he arrived, my colleague, and I thought, right, I'm going to use the power of visualization. I just read a book, and it will come to me. But it's from another negotiator. It talks about creating the golden gateway. And it just sat with me, and I thought, I am absolutely going to talk about this. And I'd established, and now I've been there 3 hours, 4 hours, got my hand, powerful hand. I got a lot of stuff I could start laying down to try and influence and persuade him now. Because people might say, well, why don't you just ask him to come to this side of the railings? Well, you always ask that early on, but they never do. Very rarely. Well, you don't want to keep pressing that because you're going to start pissing people off. And you're not then recognising how they're genuinely feeling. You're trying to find solutions as opposed to working with that dinosaur emotional brain, right? So Dave arrived, he comes back and I said, right, I'd worked out the thing that was stopping this guy from coming was about face. He wanted to save face. I needed to help him save face. And it was about pride. And he kept saying, well, I've come this far down the journey now. I can't possibly come to that side of the railings. It's almost like you get on a train. Yeah. It gets faster and faster and faster, and the train stations just keep flying by. You need somebody to slow that down. And I think that's what a good negotiator does. And I slowed the train down to a point where I was able to paint a picture. So I now start throwing the ace cards down. You're a proud man, Dave. You've told me you have not had a day sick in 40 years. Man, what a work ethic you've got. What you have done for society. So compliments and flattery, and when you talk about flattery, it could be, it's a nice bag, nice set of shoes, nice watch. It goes beyond that. There's a term called altar casting. It's a little bit like blowing the veritable smoke up somebody's rear, but it's done in a way that's sincere. And it's like, Dave, you've told me who you are. I'm sensing I know you as an individual, particularly around your application to work. You're a grafter. You're on the coalface. You know what? If I had a team doing what you're doing, I would want you on my team 100%. So I'm playing to his ego. And I said, well, imagine this. There's me and Dave here, right? And just on the other side of this railing, so in between us was like a pavement. I said, imagine there's a cube, a metre square cubed, right? And it's got written on all the sides, 6 sides, isn't there, on a cube? Pride. Dave's pride on every side. I said, I tell you what me and Dave are going to do now. And I'm thinking to myself, God, this is better work, because if this doesn't work, we're going to lay my ace cards down. Where do you go? You then got to build your hand up again. I said, I'm going to get a saw out. And I'm bringing him in from a visual perspective. I said, my friend here is going to grab the other side of the saw. It's one of these big ones, like lumberjack shoes. So I'm now really painting a picture. And we're going to start cutting through this. So we start doing the movement. So I'm thinking, oh my God, people on the cordon. We've now done the crab thing. Now we're doing making out like lumberjacks. And I said, look, all right, we've cut through it. But I'm being serious here. I'm not joking when I'm with him. I know, it might sound quite comical now. I say what we're going to do. We're going to pull that apart. We're going to create a gateway for you. So I'm now slowing the train down. I put the brakes on. So the guy who was with me, he was always called Dave, but Sully, his surname, says, Sully, you get that side, I'll get this side. Pull it apart for you. Pull your side aside, and I'll do my side. So we've now gets our hands in, and we pull this imaginary. You can see it now. I can see that you're all seeing this block. This is where I had Dave, right? And I said, there you go. This ain't about pride, Dave. I said, this is about doing the right thing. Same as you've done the right thing all throughout your life. You've got up every morning, you've gone to work, you've grafted, you've fixed things to provide a service for the public that you care about. You know what the right thing is to do. Come on. And I can feel it now, reliving that. And I saw him shuffle, and he tries to get his leg up, and he's that cold, he struggles to get his leg up. And then so I threw a little bit of humour in there. And I said something like, fucking hell, mate, this is what old age does to you, innit? And I said, look, I'll just step. I said, do you want me to tell or do you want me to take a step back? And he's still a bit edgy. He said, no, it's okay. He said, and I knew now, I knew he was coming over, but this is the most critical point, because if he slips, and the last thing you want to do is, I say the last thing, they teach this no grab policy.
Right.
I was wondering, actually.
Yeah. Well, you look at it this way. If you go to grab somebody,
they pull away.
And they pull away, well, they're going and they can drag you over as well. But also from afar, it could look like you're pushing them. And so it's fraught with danger. It's an inherent risk being a negotiator. Your natural reaction is to serve somebody, so to grab. So you've got to be mindful of that. But I've seen it done and it's been successful. I've never seen it happen where, particularly the team I worked on, where it's not worked. But the general rule is you don't grab. Anyway, going back to Dave. You know, he had a little chuckle. And he now gets his torso more over the railing, so he's creating his own pendulum to get his leg over. And he was like late 60s, this guy. And the other thing is not to rush. And what I also saw in a lot of the jobs I dealt with that, and I think this is a difference between a negotiator and some cops, not all cops, but some. It's like, oh, we've got to go and grab him, we've got to detain him, we've got to go and put him in a police car, we've got to arrest him for something. It's like, chill out. This guy's just had 4-5 hours on a bitterly cold morning in February. The guy's in a shit place mentally, emotionally, and physically now. Calm down, right? He gets over. You know what the first thing he said to me? He says, thanks, Marcus. He said, but I'm busting for a piss. Can I go to that bush just over there? I says, of course you can, mate. And that's another thing. It's like, you know, riding and being responsible for that. Because you could get anybody that complains, couldn't you? To say, oh, you know, the cops save the day, but they allow a man to go and have a wee, urinate in public. I didn't care. You know, I could justify why I'd allowed him to do that. And, you know, we sat in the back of the car. We went into the back of the ambulance. Cup of coffee, you know, he got himself wrapped up. And it's those sort of jobs that you really remember. But, you know, when you think about reflection, I've still got my notes from that job. I've got them on my phone, you know, no kind of personal details, but the things that worked, the things that worked, and it was similarity, it was the influence of creating a vision, slowing down, lots of Cialdini stuff. But you don't always get the chance to speak to the person you've been with, to say, what was it that can you just tell me? And I think that's one thing. I mean, it's a difficult thing to do, isn't it? To then gain feedback from somebody who's been suicidal.
Yeah, I wondered if you ever did get follow-ups. So you save someone and they come back and go, thanks for you got me out of that. You never had that.
No. But this is why you would never lie with somebody who's suicidal, because you could quite often find yourself in that same place with that same person the week after. And if you've bullshitted them the week before,
you're done.
Trust, you've lost the lot. So yeah, that's one that sticks in my. I mean, listen, there's quite a few jobs.
Man, that was like a Hollywood film. I was picturing that in my head all the way along.
Yeah. At the end of the day,
he lost his
life.
job. Is that what it was about? You're like, boy.
It was his health. It was health issues,
right.
And he was very. He was very insecure.
I didn't want to leave a cliffhanger there. I was like,
no. Well,
what his story was.
He had significant health issues. Right. Was like incapacitating his ability to go about his daily business. So he was going to work in pain, but he still cracked on. He had a younger partner who he had suspicions around maybe wasn't being wholly faithful. So he wasn't in a great place. And I was always very proud of what I did. It's a process you can't rush.
Yeah, so I said 5 hours of that is that's
yeah,
a long,
you can't rush. And it's like, we spoke before this podcast, right? That an hour's listening, an hour to listen is tiring.
Yeah.
But to listen well, oh my God, there's lots of things. But I've probably touched on a few there. Absorbing what somebody said, understanding the story, knowing what's driving the behaviour, and really absorbing that and putting yourself in their shoes. And when I had that opportunity to make like a crab down the side there and back, nothing was said, but you could see that he appreciated the fact that I was also cold. I was in his world to a degree, and that we were, a lot of rapport's built at subconscious level, and I'm convinced that was another ace card in my hand, but it was something that I couldn't push out later down the line. Not like your work ethic or you're a proud individual, not none of those things. It was just there to help build the rapport. But yeah, lots of jobs.
Brilliant.
Next time you tell our story, mate, if you at the beginning of it, when they first find the guy, if the police have got somebody get me Ollie, and then it goes to the police chief and they're like, somebody find me Ollie, and then when it comes to you, you get in the police car, you put the light on the top and race to it yourself. I think it'll add a little bit more flavour to it, but that was an awesome story, mate.
I wish. Well, we did have the days when we did have blue lights. You could just stick on top of your squad car, plane car, yeah. But they don't have that nowadays.
And what would be the sort of limit on you as a singular person? Obviously, I know you've got a team supporting you doing that, writing notes, all that sort of stuff. But what time scale you go, I can't do any more here. We have to have someone else jump in and you go back to back with someone. I think you mentioned that before, you work in partnership.
Yeah, you probably see me there take a large inhale of breath, because there is, that physiological response to an actual job where that happened. I know we ain't got time to talk about that, but it was a guy, essentially a guy in the woods who had a shotgun. Again, had health issues. He wanted to take himself out, and that was about a 9-hour job. And so so you'll be working in a pair. So we were stood there behind Kevlar shields. This was a job where you would wear your helmet and stuff next to some guys that had the firearms, cops. And so there'll be two negotiators, and then you've got a coordinator, and your coordinator essentially doesn't get involved in the the verbal negotiation. They'd be the conduit between you and the commander on the ground. So they would be advising the commander, but they also have a duty to look after your welfare and advise on tactics, because you don't really make the decisions as a negotiator, and that's a great tactic to actually use. It's like, why isn't this happening? Why is that happening? You can always project and put blame onto somebody else, which is a great tactic to use.
We've got a couple of working accounts for us, haven't we? We deflect stuff to.
Yeah, no, deflection's a great one, and it's that projection. When they say, well, it's not my, it's not my fault I'm here, it's the cops' fault because they came to arrest me and they've chased me. Or if they hadn't come to arrest me or chase me, I wouldn't have done this. Yeah, I mean, I can see where you're coming from, if the cops come, so you can play to that. But this job, when the guy, the coordinator said, and again, this was late at night, and he's like, look, this is looking like it's going to go on. I'm saying, and I his name, Chris, the coordinator. I said, Chris, Give me another hour. I'm happy to go for another hour. Bearing in mind, I was on the CID and I got a big jacket on, from a grab bag. Foolishly, I didn't have any decent footwear. I had a pair of office shoes in a wood, piss wet through. Feet were getting a bit gibbering. But you also got to, it's like, this is where you got to leave your ego at the door. So it's like, yeah, you want to save the day, but you've also got to be smart enough and emotionally intelligent enough to manage your ego and think, you know what, whilst I want to see this through and I want to keep it, it's like letting go of a baby. You don't like doing that. Sometimes you've got to make that call. And he was mindful of this. And I said, look, just give me 1 hour. If after an hour, anyway, we got that job resolved. He ended up getting rushed in the end. It got dark. We had to negotiate some lighting kit to come in. And we positioned them in such a way that his night vision was
going.
Yeah, it had gone. Yeah, it had gone. And so the firearms cops were slowly edging in, and they ended up, rushing him in the end. But yeah, so most jobs like that are over in a handful of hours, if not minutes, some of them. But your K&R jobs or your sieges, barricaded criminals, they tend to go on a lot longer. Several hours, and sometimes overnight into the following day. Yeah. And so you'd have a change of guard. And that's why it's really important that, your team are all working to the same principles, because it needs to be smooth, right? And, somebody coming in and picking a job up when you've built such a great rapport. And that's why you'd never change two straight away. It's like a football team, right? So make 5 subs at once, you're creating chaos. Yeah. Just change one at a time. Get them embedded, get them to get a feel of it, understand the picture. It's the same principles.
Yeah, you can't exactly go 5 minutes, guys. Yeah. I'm clocking off here.
And I know we're going to do it on the course, right? Yeah. It's like, we'll have a change of, why am I speaking to somebody different? Yeah. Well, you need to think that, because you do get asked that. Why am I speaking to somebody different? Why can't you stay?
When you were given that bit, the long story you just did there, and it's obviously so much to it, and I was like, oh my God, you should teach us, which obviously you do. As a scenario for you, let's just say a guy wanted to go to the Army Navy game, at a Marines reunion in the same month, and a jiu-jitsu competition, and needed to negotiate the weekends, all them weekends. On the,
I know, that penny's dropped now. I know what you're asking.
Where would you start? I'm joking, but for people understanding of how you improve these sort of skills, and you cover a bit of detecting deception on course as well. And I remember years ago, it was on the news. There was a murder in Australia. It was a sort of British girl, and her partner got murdered. And I remember watching it. This must be like 20, 25 years ago. Not that I'm any good at this stuff, but I watched it, and she said her partner got murdered, and it just something didn't look right of how she was sort of talking. I couldn't even put it into words, really. And I remember, and then eventually she got kind of put in the frame. She never got done for it. I think she was cleared eventually, and somebody else got done for the murder. But it was something not quite right, and you kind of see it now and again. Don't you, on different on Crime Watch, or not Crime Watch, whatever it used to be, of when somebody's done the murder and they're speaking, asking for witnesses and things. What are we seeing then as what natural ability have we spotted in people to see that people are tricking us? So, I know you cover a bit on the course, but just for
yeah, well, as you know, I'm halfway through studies, master's degree in looking at this, and it's such a vast area. Non-verbal body language is huge. And, when you hear people say, I'm intuitive, something doesn't quite look right, something doesn't quite sound right, that's because people are saying that because they are not trained. They don't practice. They don't practice looking at and analysing, well, what is it that's not quite right? So it's your intuition. So from an early age, we pick up, don't we, when things are not quite right. And that kind of sits in our subconscious. And what your subconscious is picking up is probably a micro expression, a slight change in tonality in the voice, just for that split second, a little shuffle, a little twitch, a little bit of somebody that's showing some discomfort. Because contrary to, mainstream, I guess, understanding to some people, there's no such thing as a lie detector. When you think about the principles of his physiology, what does it detect? Detects stress.
Yeah, changing the baseline. It does say the same.
It changes it detects the change in a person's physiology. That's what it. So from a buying a product on the market, but from a trained eye where you haven't got any apparatus, you are looking for a change, and that's sometimes you might not have a lot of time to see change, but it could be change from the norm. So although you might not have a baseline of an individual, so that's the general behaviour. Some people might be foot tappers, some people might be, massive nodders, some people might talk really quick, and it's a change from that. And if you don't have time to baseline, then from my experience, it would be a change from the norm. What would be the average person behave like this? Because that might be the only time you've got. And so you are, to the untrained individual, your intuition picks up on all these cues and clues. But to somebody who's trained, you would pick up on those subtleties, and then that would maybe give you an indication that something's not right. Now, that something that's not right might not necessarily mean that they're lying to you.
Yeah.
That something that's not right means that there's discomfort and they're stressed for whatever reason that might be. It might be they're doing a podcast and not used to doing a podcast. So, you can see them. I don't mean to say that they're blagging or they're being deceitful. And so context is, changing behaviour and context is key. I
suppose you reference it to what either you would behave like or what you've seen previously, and why something looks a bit in your subconscious. Obviously not to go into it, it's a bit controversial, but I suppose that's partly the reason why the McCanns, they just didn't look something like a bit off.
Controversies on this episode.
Yeah, I mean, everybody will have a view on that. Everybody will have a view on that. It's really hard to say, isn't it? Unless you know them personally. Well, I wouldn't behave like that. Well, that's the me theory. That's how you wouldn't behave, but that's how they.
That's why you can normally tell your own kids, can't you? Because you know what their baseline is, and if they're saying something in a different way, you can normally pick up that.
I always say, if I'm delivering comms training, and I go, say who's the person that's going to be able to tell? If we're having this conversation like that, it's like, who's the one person who can probably tell if you're blagging it? And all the lads are like, my missus.
Yeah.
Or most people say, my mum.
Yeah.
And that's because they're the people that are closest to you. So they know how you behave on a day-to-day basis. Don't mean to say they're always right. So, I'm probably watching this podcast and I say, oh, well, you're changing, you're blagging it, you're lying. No, but there's something going on. It just might feel, if I feel under pressure a little bit, I giggle and laugh a little bit. Well, don't mean to say you're lying. Don't mean to say you're being deceitful. It's just a physiological release, But yeah, it gives you, what it does give you is an indication to perhaps focus your conversation in those areas where you've seen the red flags. Yeah.
I suppose you can become more uncomfortable if you think people are judging you as well, and change your behaviour, how you come across.
Oh, I mean, I've lost count of how many police interviews I've done. That was one of the best parts of the job. Interviewing, I'll call them villains, but interviewing individuals, and seeing how people behave during those interviews. And some you knew, just from the evidence you had, that they were guilty of said offence. But there are others that you didn't necessarily have the evidence, but there was enough for them to be under arrest on suspicion of, because that when somebody's arrested, they're under arrest on suspicion of. Don't necessarily mean you've got the evidence. So when you're interviewing, if you've got good, strong evidence and they're blagging it, you can then start to see the signs where you're producing a particular exhibit in interview, which is quite damning, whether it's fingerprint evidence or it's a knife you've found or whatever it is.
You're looking to elicit a response from them. When
Yeah,
you're
but
doing
you could never, you know, contrary to what people might think watching crime dramas, let's be honest, the TVs are flooded with policey stuff. If it's not policey stuff, it's hospital stuff.
Yeah.
Cops don't interrogate. You interview. You know, it'd be inadmissible if you interrogated, or if it felt that it was slightly oppressive, it would be thrown out. You'd lose the job. So we don't interrogate. Is that snow? Sounds like it's raining. And you can't make reference. You couldn't ask a question and say, and they respond and then go, but yeah, Pete, I appreciate what you're saying, but I couldn't help but notice when you answered that question, you were starting to shuffle in your seat a little bit, or
you tilted your head to the left.
Your head, or, you know, your voice increased in pitch.
He doesn't lie to me though, so it's,
you couldn't, your solicitor, you know, this, I just want to settle any kind of perceptions people might have. The solicitor would be all over you and say that, you know, where's your accreditation to say that? You know, my voice is raised in there because I'm excited in saying that.
Suspicious.
It's good though. Lie to me, wasn't it? That's a good point.
Yeah. Well, lie to me. It's
based on
the academics that have helped with the production of that are the academics that are running our master's program.
Yeah.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Yeah, because the guy he talks about is a real person. That the data's all written about. You know, he talks about that guy who lived with tribes and stuff in the villages and learned about. I can't remember his name. But
Paul Ekman.
That's it.
Yeah.
Really
I mean, Paul Ekman is. I say underwritten's the right thing, but Paul Ekman is involved with the Emotional Intelligence Academy, which is the academy I'm doing my studies through. And Cliff Lansley and another, you know, top academic, Dawn Archer, you know, these you know, they're all over body language, deception detection. So this is one thing why I'm jumping onto it, albeit they've just taken a bit of a stall at the moment. You know, life circumstances. So I'm kind of halfway through, but you know, I've applied it in a practical sense, not necessarily checking out deception. Yeah, police interviews and stuff, but you know, that human interaction just fascinates me. And I know when I'm listening to Barry's podcast, you know, he talks a little bit about that relationship building and stuff, and I think it comes back to that very first thing we spoke about in the podcast, emotional intelligence. The more you know about human engineering, human relation, whatever you want to call it, and being able to navigate some of those tricky and choppy waters and find a way through to building collaboration and you know, essentially trust. Once you've got trust, then you can go where you need to go.
Brilliant, mate. There's so much we can talk about here and go on, but it'd be quite interesting to, just as we come to sort of finish up in what you're actually doing now and where you're using a lot of these skills now in a corporate setting. Now you sort of stepped away from the police and.
Well, it's an interesting concept that people have. You know, you do your time in the police, and it's got this retiring from the police. So people think you're retired. No, I'm. You know, despite what you might think, I'm too young to retire. I don't want to retire. You know, so I left the police 2.5 years ago. And I thought, right, so leading up to that, I thought, what am I going to do? I've got a bunch of skills. I want to do something that is around people, around training, around helping others, right? So I set up my company called the Bureau.
Cool name.
Pardon?
Cool name.
Yeah. Well, I was speaking to a friend years ago, and I was talking about I need a company name, and we just got chatting and brainstorming. And I said, what about the Bureau? There's an element of mystique around that. So I don't just want to be like, I didn't want to present myself as, oh, I'm a trainer, I'm a communications trainer. I wanted a bit of an edge. And so, the Bureau Consultancy. And for the first kind of year and a half, so up to kind of autumn last year, I look back now, and this is about that embracing failure, embracing reflection. What am I not quite doing right? What can I change? And I was trying to do too much. I was trying to cover 1 million, but you maybe found this when you started your Frontier Risk. I'm trying to cover public speaking, communications training, leadership training,
doing too much,
comm skills, negotiate. It's like anybody looking at that business is like, what are you actually doing? Because you're spinning a lot of plates there. So through a few, through the networks and what have you, and reflecting on you've got to make a living, right? So I've now put that 30 years of experience together and developed kind of a few products. But what seems to be really taking traction is training professionals in the security industry. I mean, as you know, you guys are in there. It's massive, right? So security officers, security guards, front of house staff. So it's bringing those elements of, winning people over. People buy from people. So giving people a first-class experience, so interpersonal skills training, mixing that together with, well, from a security aspect, how can we make people, assets and property safe? What do security officers do to ensure they do that? And so I found myself creating a structured course that I'm just in the process of getting accredited CPD. So I think that's really important. Because people do ask that. Some people like a shiny sticker in the CV, don't they? And some people want it to go towards credits and stuff. So I think that's really important. It's a good sell. But it's a structured 2-day course, which essentially looks at aspects around self-awareness. So I spoke about it quite a bit. Situational and environmental awareness, spoke about that. Understanding what's going on in front of you and the impact that you're having and all that jazz. Interpersonal skills, and then some behavioural profiling with some then immersive stress testing. And I think that's where the limited knowledge I have in this industry, being out of the police not only a few years now, is that security professionals don't do that enough. Stress testing. They don't do that immersive. It's like, oh, I've done this course online, or I've been and done this 2-day course, box ticked, it's in my CV. Well, okay, well, how are you keeping those skills up? Because you are going to get skill fade in, very quickly. Yeah. We know from immersive learning that the retention of information and how we apply ourselves to our craft, that if you immerse yourself in those moments, crisis, role playing, whatever you want to call it, you go through the cycle of, the competent, being conscious and competent to a point where you are unconscious, but you're very competent with it because you've done it. It's like driving. We're very unconscious in the moment, but you're a good driver. So that's what I'm doing now, delivering those courses. Have gone down amazingly well. I mean, the feedback's been fantastic. But in addition to that, in between the margins, still continue to do leadership development training for another company called Fieri Leadership Development. Been a brilliant company to work for, which I know we spoke about. We've been together over a beer. So working with individuals from grassroots through to senior management, all things to do with leadership. But my real passion is around those human relations, but how do we do that? How do we do that well? And it's all those aspects I spoke about that's in the course. So it's exciting. It's exciting. And obviously with, what's going to be happening this year with Martin's Law, that's potentially going to be agreed in government, what that means to venues, to companies that run events. How are you prepared? How are you preparing your staff? Is an online course good enough? Or do they actually need face-to-face training with stress, regular stress testing?
I know you also do stuff with premiership teams, pharmaceutical companies, exec boards, sort of like corporate deal maker sort of stuff. And there's as much as you said you do cover a lot of ground is important. There's a lot. you're not just doing one thing. You're doing quite. It's still doing quite. It's still quite broad.
You got to keep your irons in fires, right?
Yeah.
So working. I'm a mentor for the Premier League. So working with individuals on coaching programs that the Premier League support. Collaborate and work with other individuals who've got their own companies as well. Working with senior leadership teams, 10 to 12 individuals, taking them through a 2, 3, 4 day journey. But that's only as good as how much they want to expose themselves and be vulnerable. My experience tells me that unless you're going to be prepared to face the hard truths around perhaps why you've been dysfunctional or disjointed or not operating at the level you are, you've got to be, grow a set, be in that safe space with the other individuals and expose each other in a sense that's professional, respectful, and allow a trainer facilitator, somebody like me, to facilitate that process so that by the time you get to the end of it, I know it's an analogy about the onion, but you've peeled the onion back and you're putting the layers back in an order that they understand and they can move forward. So it's like a reset. And again, I spoke earlier about that behavioural change stairway. I'm actually applying that with client. So you spend the first day, then you turn up, you got all the accreditation in the world, but they've got to believe in you. They've got to know that you care about what you're there for. You're not just there for the paycheck, that you follow through with, if you've got resources, if you say we're going to be back, we're going to do this, following that through and making it about them. And then, then you can then start to see how the ACE cards and you can see how that builds up through the programs. And then by, you're high-fiving on day 4. Everybody feels great. Everybody feels like they've been invested in. People have had their say, that they had the autonomy, and they've got a full-on reset. So, done quite a bit of that, and that's very rewarding.
Good.
Yeah.
It's good to see you succeeding, mate. It's always a challenge, mate. When you first leaving and finding your space, and it looks like you're sort of down that right path now, anyway, of utilising your skill set well and making money doing it, which is brilliant.
You got to enjoy it, haven't you? If I didn't enjoy it, I wouldn't be doing it.
Mate, completely. We obviously know a fair bit about you, mate, but we both sat here completely fascinated. And we always say if we ever get kidnapped again, hopefully you're the one who can negotiate a release for us. Honestly, it was really enjoyed that.
The last thing I would say, I'm sensing we're kind of wrapping up, is always remember to smile. I don't know how much I smiled during this, but I think, it doesn't cost a lot.
You got good teeth as well, mate.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, I've got a good dentist. Yeah. But you've got to smile. It's very disarming. It makes you feel good. And guess what? The studies tell you that people who smile more live longer. So don't be miserable, eh?
Brilliant. Give your time, mate.
Cheers, Ollie.
Awesome. Appreciate that. Thanks a lot,
Cheers,
guys.
mate.
Thank you.